This is a video on how this ceramic geometrical composition in Dewsbury was made. The original version can be found in a 13th century madrasa in Meknes, the Bou Inania Madrasa. The original is much smaller than this, and it was made in the traditional Zillij style, which is typical for Morocco. Zillij style means little geometrical shapes that are hand cut from square tiles into shapes that can be assembled, and most of the geometrical compositions that you see in the madrasas in Morocco are made in this way. So what I wanted to do is to make something that uses that same technique but much larger scale and somewhat contemporary. The objective for me was to create something that all generations could enjoy in this neighborhood in Dewsbury. For that reason I chose a traditional composition but then used different colors, non-gloss tiles to give it a 21st century relevance. That was really the objective for me. What was also important was to create a composition that followed the principles of best practice as much as possible. So this means, for example, that I wanted quarter stars on the corners of the composition, and also that I used color to help make this complex composition more visually digestible. Colors are not just there to make something beautiful, they're also there to make something accessible. So that, for example, when you see it from a distance, you can see the big geometrical shapes. As you come closer, you can see the smaller geometrical shapes. It's all done to facilitate engagement with the viewer. So where did I start with this composition? Well, first I needed a good photo, and using that photo I created a grid of squares onto which I knew I would need to place this composition. Because it's a 4-fold composition, I knew that that would work. I also had to be aware of the scale, of course, so that I knew that the shapes that this composition needed would be able to fit onto ceramic tiles of 20 by 20 centimeters. I knew that my composition had to be approximately 4 meters wide and approximately 9 meters high. I also knew eventually that my geometrical composition, half of it at least, a quarter panel, was 17 squares wide. This means that the full width of the composition, which would be 2 quarter panels wide, was 35 squares, because they share a vertical single band of shapes where they meet, hence 35. So then I could divide 4 meters by 35, which would give me a unit size. That would give me the scale, and that would be the structure that would allow me to create this, so that it could be manufactured accurately by waterjet cutting ceramic tiles. The other benefit of using a grid of squares is that, as you can see here, I'm able to say that certain stars have to be in very specific locations, i.e. sitting on top of 2 by 2 squares, so that even when the composition gets quite complicated, I can still say, well, I know for sure that this big 8-pointed star has to sit here, and I know that this small 8-pointed star has to sit there. As with any geometrical composition, you don't need to know how to design the entire thing. You just need to be able to design an element that can be repeated, either by mirroring it along a vertical or a horizontal axis, or using translation symmetry to place it above or below or to the left or to the right of your original design. In this case we had to use mirror symmetry to make this composition. So here you can see a quarter panel that I've drawn, and here you can see a quarter panel that we've made by waterjet cutting square ceramic tiles in the right shape. Before we did that though, we made a wooden test panel to make sure that everything fit, and we found out that it didn't. We found out, for example, that shapes that are supposed to be mirror images of other shapes were not exactly that. They were slightly off. So that's a problem when you're manufacturing. You can see that this wooden test panel can also fit on a grid of squares, whereby the stars on the corners, these all sit exactly on a square in the corner, as you can see here. After the small test panel, we wanted to make a bigger test panel from ceramics, but for this to be achievable we had to make sure that we cut the right shapes in the right colors in the right quantities. So for that to happen we had to number all the shapes and identify in an Excel sheet what we needed exactly to make the composition. So here you can see all the shapes of the test panel arranged. It measures 2 by 2 meters, and we also realized that cutting out all the shapes and putting them in the right position on the table is one thing, but They of course have to be cemented to a backboard and they have to be grouted, which is also quite complex and has to be done very accurately. We realized quite quickly that the best way to do that is to subdivide this 2 by 2 meter panel into sections of approximately 65 by 65 centimeters and then assemble them in that way. We cut some templates out of plastic with a 3mm grout line, which made it much easier to place the cut ceramic shapes in the right position and then place them on the right position on the backboard and grout them. Here you can see the completed test panel being delivered on site in Dewsbury. We had to bring it there because we wanted to see what it would look like in daylight, and we also needed to get approval from the council to make sure that they liked the composition and that they liked the colors, which fortunately they did. Once we had approval, we knew that we could start manufacturing the entire composition. So we had to think about how are we going to practically put all these little pieces onto an area of 4 by 9 meters, very high up on a building. What we decided to do is to put a mesh on the back of the 60 by 60 segments. As you can see here, it's not completely mesh. We then cut out pieces within the shapes so that there would be more adhesion, that the mesh wouldn't completely sit between the backboard and the tiles, but that there would be direct contact between the tiles and the cement and the backboard. In this photo the mesh sits on the front, but that's just so that we could see how it would fit when we cut it. When we glued it, it was on the back, of course. We ended up with over 70 pieces meshed together, and these all had to be stacked in the right order on a pallet and taken to the site, so that the top meshed piece was the first piece that had to go up on the wall, otherwise it would have been just too complicated. As you can see here, some of the geometric shapes are made out of more than one piece of tile. This is because the shape was too big for a 20 by 20 centimeter tile, so they ended up becoming composite shapes. What we then had to do is, after we'd grouted the whole composition, was to paint the grout in the right color so that some of these shapes that were made up of more than one piece of tile looked like a single shape rather than 3 shapes or 2 shapes with grout going down the middle. That wouldn't make any sense. So it was a big job for the tiler after he'd done all the hard work to get back on the scaffolding with a little array of different special paints and to paint all the grout lines where they needed to be painted. Lastly, we also wanted to give some information to the local community about what the origins were of this composition. So we decided that the best way to do this was to choose a big local boulder from a quarry, cut off a slice, and then on the smooth surface we would engrave this text. We chose this text because we hoped that the local community would be curious to find out what this word Zillij means, and also to simply make a connection with the past, to show where this composition originally came from. This entire project took 2 years, from the very first conversations that I had with the Zakaria Education Centre to the final unveiling. Of course, this was a team effort and there were many people involved. It's important to mention that the manufacturing and the installation was done by Rockiyat Tiles in Preston. They did a fantastic job and they really put in a lot of effort to make this composition fit. For all of us involved, it was a real privilege to do this project for a neighbourhood like the Savile town area in Dewsbury. It was an opportunity to make something new, to take a traditional visual heritage and to create something for the 21st century.